Good afternoon. I hope this after lunch I can keep you guys awake. Okay. I am not a baseball historian. I am a fan. I'm here today to present the history of an executive of the Negro League, my great-grandfather, Dr. J.B. Martin Sr. I'm telling this story in a 20-minute time slot to not only enlighten the public about my great-grandfather, but it's also my campaign to get him inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. I have given this presentation once before in 2008 at the Jerry Malloy Conference. I may have a slight bias in this situation, but I believe that his accomplishments are an integral part in the Negro Leagues, and his lifetime warrants consideration for induction. After hearing this story, I hope you feel the same way too. The Martin brothers were born in Holly Springs, Mississippi in the late 1800s. Their parents were Black landowners and farmers. W.S. was born in 1880. J.B. was born in 1885. A.T. was born in 1886, and B.B. was born in 1889. The initials used in the Martin's names did not stand for anything. It was explained to me by my grandparents that the Martin parents were born into slavery and did not receive a formal education. Therefore, they did not have full command of the English language. And so they named their children with initials for the ease of writing. Some of the history books that I've looked over the years have tried to give the brothers names instead of initials. I've seen W.S. Martin, John B. Martin. All of these are incorrect. Their names were initials. Now, our names, which are unique, have been scrutinized throughout our lives. In my life, I've been sent to the principal's office, audited by the IRS, moved to the back of the line in DMV. I've had TSA ticket issues. So most of my applications are rejected or I've been told to refile under a correct name spelling. Living with this name is great, but it has its fallbacks. The Martins relocated to Memphis in 1897 when Dr. Martin Sr. was 12 years old. In 1909, Dr. J.B. Martin Sr. married Lula McGuire, and from this union, two sons were born, J.B. Martin Jr. and W.S. Martin. This picture is of my grandfather, J.B. Martin Jr. All the Martins attended Meharry's professional schools in Nashville, Tennessee, and became prominent leaders in the city of Memphis, Tennessee. W.S. was a physician, J.B. Martin was a pharmacist, A.T. Martin was a physician, and B.B. Martin was a dentist. J.B. graduated from pharmacy school in 1910 at the age of 25 and borrowed $250 to open his pharmacy on Florida Street in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, here are the brothers in the late 1920s. All of their pictures taken, the brothers stood in this order. To me, that lends me to believe that the brothers had a sense of order and family hierarchy. From left to right is BB, AT, JB, and WS. And you can tell from this picture that the brothers were professionally dressed, but from future pictures, you can tell this was prior to them making money. Now, the Martin brothers, through their professional careers, were able to put their money together to expand in other areas of business. In that era, Blacks weren't able to go to a bank and ask for a loan. Therefore, individuals that had money became unofficial lending institutions. In 1929, the original owner of the Memphis Red Sox and Lewis Stadium, Robert Bubba Lewis, borrowed some money from the Martin brothers. After a series of rainouts and that resulted in several missed payments, the Martin brothers foreclosed on Lewis, taking first his park and then his team. They were shrewd business people. Dr. Martin, JB, and WS were principal owners with their brothers AT and BB, later buying interest in the Memphis Red Sox.
Stadium were bought by the Martins, 4 brothers, all in medical professions. J.B. Martin, a pharmacist, was the guiding force behind the team.
And Dr. Martin was not only a pharmacist, but he was a business leader. I don't know how many pies his hands were not in. He was a great political leader and a great leader of the city in terms of movements.
If you wanted a job anywhere in the city, out of the city, anywhere that's connected in you, and you go there and tell them WS, J.B. Martin sent you there, you pretty much got a job.
And that was a part of the romance of the Red Sox, that the Martin brothers owned them.
In the South of the 1930s, African Americans rarely wielded this kind of political power. So ball players from other cities quickly came to realize they had entered into an unusual
a unique situation that Black ball players found themselves in Memphis allowed them to play in comfort, knowing they were surrounded by similar people. Not only did the Martins provide social sports entertainment for the summer, but if you became ill and needed healthcare services, you had to cross the path of at least one of the Martin brothers in Memphis. The Memphis Red Sox were an integral part of the Memphis area from the 1920s to the late 1950s. The Martins remained involved in Negro League baseball for the next 31 years until its end in 1960. The Memphis Red Sox oscillated between Negro Southern League and the Negro National League from 1929 to 1936 under the helm of the Martins. In 1937, the team became a charter member of the Negro American League. And in 1939, JB was elected president of the Negro American League, a position he held for 21 years. Martin Stadium, where the Memphis Red Sox played, was one of the few African-American owned stadiums in the Negro Leagues. Martin Stadium became a social institution in Memphis for African-Americans in that area. A sense of pride about the stadium developed because it was owned and operated by African-Americans. The original stadium built by Mr. Lewis was a wood structure. This picture shows the stadium after it was remodeled in 1947 by W.S. Martin. The structure was made out of metal and could seat over 8,000 people. Sunday doubleheaders at Martin Stadium were the place to be for African Americans in Memphis. The Red Sox entertained for 30 years, from the 1930s to the 1960s. The local churches in the area would let out early so patrons could attend the games. African Americans would come to games dressed in their Sunday best, making it a spectacle to behold. Because Dr. Martin Sr.'s influence he was able to invite dignitaries to show up to his events. In this picture, we have Judge Dr. Smith and Mayor Gage of Kansas City. Dr. Martin, over the years, had several entertainers at his ballparks, ranging from the Olympian Jesse Owens to singer Rufus Thomas and guitarist B.B. King. Due to the Martins' professional careers and their ownership of the baseball team, it allowed them to become prominent leaders in the Memphis community. JB's leadership skills were also in the political arena. His influence in the community allowed JB to become the chairman of the Negro Republican Party in 1940 in Memphis. And then a personal crisis happened in 1940 that would change the direction of Dr. J.B. Martin's life. African-American Republican leader Robert Church and J.B. Sr. supported fellow Republican presidential candidate Wendell Willkie, and against the wishes of Democratic leader Ed Crump in 1940, presidential elections. This rift with Boss Crump resulted in threats to the Martins and Church's life and careers, causing Martin to move from Memphis to Chicago in the fall of 1940.
The ballpark wasn't the only local institution owned by Martin. His drugstore was considered a showplace and a center of community life.
In that day, it was a very modern drugstore. Beautiful floor, soda fountain, Sunday frappes, that drugstore in North Memphis, another one right by Bookwash Food Service drugstore. And these places became the social mecca for the people of the community of some status. It was more than just a drugstore, it was a gathering place for things that happened to the people of South Memphis.
Martin's power, however, had its limits, and soon those limits would be put to the test, for Memphis was a white man's town, and the white man who ran it was known as Boss Crump.
I don't know of any place in America where one man controlled the town as well as that Crump, and during my lifetime, didn't hold elected office. But what he said was law and gospel.
Dr. Martin, the druggist, broke with the Crump line on some election. I don't remember the one.
During the 1940 political campaign, Debbie Martin was a Republican. In fact, in my early days, all black were Republicans. They only switched about 36. They started voting for Roosevelt and later became Democrats. And Debbie Martin in 40 was supporting Wendell Wilson.
The police shortly after announced they suspected his drugstore being a front for drug dealing, and there were detectives out there. They searched everybody who went in, and usually they weren't too nice about it, which quickly withered his business. And African women being taken there to get. It seems to me we went more than I got more chocolate sodas than we used to. I think it was my father's way of showing some loyalty, helping raise the flag.
Everybody who walked in there was searched, body searched, and wasn't easy. People would stand and search once or twice, but the police thought that searching was not going to do it, then they could become verbally abusive. The reaction seemed to be no more than a man walked down the street and saw an ant crawling and stepped on it. It created a little ripple, but nobody wanted to speak for the rest.
It was all talk and no action. Coming forward in Dr. Martin's support would cause heavy scrutiny to whoever was involved. Not only Dr. Martin's career was threatened and his rights violated, but according to my grandmother, who lived in the apartment over the pharmacy, his life was threatened. Word had gotten back to Dr. Martin that he was about to be lynched. So he and his wife left Memphis in the middle of the night, and they left for Chicago to stay with his in-laws. JB's move to Chicago turned out to be a prosperous venture. With the resources that Dr. Martin had, he acquired while in Memphis, he was able to put together a deal with a group of investors to buy the failing Negro League team, the Chicago American Giants, in 1941. JB's love of baseball ownership would not allow him to be denied.
Chicago. There, he became owner of the Chicago American Giants baseball team. He was also elected to the highest public office an African American had ever held in that city. And he reigned as the president of the Negro American League for the next 2 decades. Back in Memphis, W.S., the oldest brother, became president of the Red Sox.
W.S. Martin, who was the oldest brother, I think, ran the College Chapel Hospital and was reputed to be very wealthy.
W.S., he didn't know nothing about how the ball played. He just furnished the money, But Dr. Martin, his brother, B.B., he was a dentist. He was a slicker. He'd slick you, his brother, and everybody else out of the book.
But W.S. was a fine fellow, but he was just cheap. The Martins had the most money, but they were the cheapest. That's right, the cheapest in the league. Cheapest son of a bitches ever lived.
As you can see, some of the players thought my great-grandfather and his brothers were tight with the dollar. The last ball player was Ted Double Duty Radcliffe, who, believe it or not, became a manager of Dr. Martin's Chicago American Giants in 1950. Once in Chicago, being a team owner and president of the Negro American League had its perks. Traveling by team bus was not an option for my great-grandparents. In this picture, you can see JB with his brothers WS and BB at a Negro American League meeting in 1946. Having brothers at your meetings help you maintain your agenda. Now, the East-West game was JB's favorite event. Hosting the biggest sporting event for African Americans for nearly 20 years at Comiskey Park in Chicago made JB a prominent figure in the Chicago area. The East-West game was the Super Bowl, World Series, NBA Finals all rolled up into one. Attendance at these annual events on its heyday was 30 to 40,000 strong. The game attracted people from all over the country.
In Chicago, JB presided over the major event of the Negro League season, the East-West game, which featured all-stars from the Negro American League against those of the Negro National.
People from all over the country were coming that day. People started going to the game at 8 o'clock in the morning. Some of them would be carrying lunch bags, bags, and everything, that early in the morning. Even to that ball time.
The catcher effectively blocked the plate and the base runner was out at home. Let us analyze this picture closely. Look at the stands in Comiskey Park. The stands are full of fans. Comiskey Park back then could hold about 32,000 people. Here you can see the brothers again, but this time their clothes look a little nicer as they made more money. JB's favorite outfit for the East-West games was his white suit topped off with a white boulder brim, pretty much like I'm wearing today. The brothers on cue for the cameras, again, lined up similar in this order. Dr. Martin's tenure as president of the Negro American Leagues, there were several major issues that influenced his effectiveness. World War II had a major effect in the Negro Leagues. World War II buildup brought jobs to America that were very lucrative for African Americans. A lot of the ball players took jobs to support their families because the pay was too good to turn down. This diminished the pool of players to choose from, thus making it hard to field teams. During World War II, the country took a very conservative approach back then about recreational travel and that being banned in the United States. This directly affected the Negro Leagues. In addition to a ban on travel, additional restrictions on gas and tire usage were placed. Bus travel was the main source of travel for the Negro League teams. The federal government during wartime put limitations on bus travel that hampered the Negro Leagues. JB had to meet with politicians and federal officials to effectively broker a deal so that the league could thrive and continue to play. Here's a picture of JB with President Eisenhower. JB's senior's political influence was one of the factors that allowed the Martins to be successful businessmen. His contacts helped him push the agenda for the Negro Baseball League. Dr. Martin's senior political aspirations never subsided while in Chicago. These aspirations allowed Dr. Martin Sr. to advance in the Republican Party in Chicago. In 1942 and 1944, he received nominations and ran for local offices, but ended up in eventual defeat. He was elected Republican committeeman for the Chicago's 3rd Ward. In 1946, In 1946, JB finally succeeded, becoming the first African-American elected to the 9-member Sanitary District Trustee Board of Chicago. While on the board, Dr. Martin was in charge of the real estate division. At the time of the election, JB held the highest elected seat in government for African Americans in the Chicago area. Dr. Martin's political influence helped him with his agenda as president of the Negro American League. The next major issue that influenced Dr. Martin's effectiveness was the rating of top ball players by the major leagues, starting with Jackie Robinson in 1947. The pool of top marquee players started to diminish as the money and glamour of the major leagues drew their attention. The players that drew patrons to the ballparks were no longer there, which caused revenues by teams to drop. The transition of players directly affected the attendance of the Negro League ballparks. It became harder and harder to draw paid patrons to the park, so the league started to suffer. Through perseverance, Dr. Martin Sr. was able to keep the league together until 1960. Here, JB is addressing a crowd prior to an exhibition game held with the major leaguers versus the major leaguers versus Negro leaguers. Dr. Martin Sr. was always professionally dressed. I myself have memories of my great-grandfather in nothing but suits and ties. He was elected to 2 terms of the Chicago Board of Sanitation District, serving as the first African-American trustee from 1946 through 1958. He was also appointed in 1960 to serve 1 year of an unexpired term of a retired trustee. And during his tenure as president, public perception was JB was too busy to hold the office of president of the Negro African American League because of his political career. Dr. Martin Sr. was a charter member and then appointed to the board of directors in 1959 of the Service Federal Savings and Loan in Chicago. And JB retired in Chicago in the early 60s after having a successful career. The stadium was sold to a Mr. Maddox in Memphis in 1961 for $110,000. A trucking company now rests on the site where Martin Stadium was. This sign right here is all that remains in South Memphis of Martin Stadium. Dr. Martin Sr. and Lula Martin lived in Hyde Park in Chicago in a 3-story brownstone building on the first 2 floors. My father, J.B. Martin III, and my mother, Dr. Barbara Martin, and my brother, Mark Martin, we all lived on the 2nd floor. This is where I got to know my great-grandfather and his story. Dr. Martin was placed in a rest home in 1970 in Michigan and died May 1st, 1973. He was 88 at the time of his death. Now, this picture here is the only picture I have with my great-grandfather. Here are all the J.B. Martins together, and I'm the little guy in the white suit. So let's talk about why he should be inducted in the Hall of Fame. Number one, Dr. Martin Sr. was a leader of men. His contributions to the national pastime were outstanding. He held an executive position in the Negro League baseball tenure as long as any other individual. And he owned 2 teams and he owned his own stadium. So these are the reasons why I think my great-grandfather should be one of the next executives put up for induction to the Baseball Hall of Fame. That's my bibliography, and I want to thank you all for listening to me and hearing my story.